So hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in a series focused on gender-based analysis plus. And today's speakers will discuss gender, indigeneity, and intersectionality in the Arctic. So my name is Dr. Shannon Nash, and I am the Director of Operations for the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NAADSN, and a postdoctoral fellow with Trent University. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Neutral people. And I recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. To briefly introduce NAADSN, we're a collaborative network providing timely, relevant, and reliable expert advice on North American and Arctic defense and security topics. Our network addresses three main core policy challenge questions, as well as their many intersection points, or core challenges rather, and that includes the defense role in the Arctic, NORAD modernization, and the future of North American defense, as well as the evolving role of major power competition. So we conduct leading edge research with students, emerging scholars, and Northern stakeholders and rights holders that test core assumptions and prompt policy innovation. And we convene workshops, symposia, and conferences, many now, or all now for the time being virtually, that bring together diverse stakeholders. And we're working with a strong group of student research fellows, and they are all currently conducting policy relevant research on contemporary defense and security topics. So I'd invite you to visit our website at naadsn.ca to view a variety of research outputs, as well as videos and event reports, and recommended reading lists and annotated bibliographies, to name a few things you'll find there. So NAADSN is thrilled to be partnering with the Defense and Security Foresight Group, the Center for Social Innovation and Community Engagement in Military Affairs, and Women in International Security Canada for this series of webinars. And I'd like to send a special thank you to Kirsty Kearney from the DSFG, their network manager, for all of her hard work behind the scenes, making these events possible this week. So the panel today will showcase gendered and Indigenous perspectives on human security, representation, and intersectionality in the Arctic. It will be an open format discussion led by our moderator, and will offer panelists the opportunity to share their personal insights and perspectives on these topics. So the panel will discuss for about an hour, and then we will turn to audience questions that you can pose through the Q&A function here on WebEx. So our panelists today range from academics, Indigenous knowledge leaders, holders, as well as policymakers to young advocates. And we're grateful to have them join us today to share their tremendous expertise and insights. So now I'd like to turn it over to NAADSN's Policy and Research Coordinator, Jill Barclay, who has taken the lead on coordinating this event with NAADSN, and she's going to go ahead and introduce our moderator and our panelists. Thanks again for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Shannon. So I'll go ahead and just introduce our moderator and our panelists, and then I'll let Bridget kick it off. So Bridget is our moderator for today's session. She is an Indigenous resident of the Northwest Territories and has extensive knowledge on Northwest Territories and broader circumpolar world. She brings a distinct worldview from that region and also shares comprehensive knowledge of research methods on Indigenous and gender issues. She serves as a policy leader and researcher with the Arctic Athabasca Council and was executive director with the Gwich'in Council International from 2007 to 2012. She has tremendous expertise on Arctic Council and Arctic governance issues, and we're very grateful to her to moderate our panel today. So our first panelist, Dr. Tawny Pryor, is a Killam postdoctoral fellow with the Marine and Environmental Law Institute out of Dalhousie University. Tawny is a lead author of Gender and Environment chapter of the 2021 Pan-Arctic Report on Gender Equality in the Arctic, and a collaborator on a project entitled Women of the Arctic Ocean, exploring the intersection of gender, indigeneity, and the law of the sea in the Canadian Arctic. Tawny also co-leads the Women of the Arctic Network, which is a nonprofit association whose mission is to raise awareness of, support for, and maintain focus on women and gender-related issues in the Arctic. Aluki Kotirik is originally from Igloolik and has been living in Iqaluit with her family since 2004. She is currently the president of Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, and after earning a bachelor and master's degree from Trent University, Aluki worked in various Inuit organizations, and as well as holding several management positions in the government of Nunavut, the Office of Languages Commissioner, and Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. Aluki has a passion for empowering and improving Inuit lives and a keen interest on how Inuit culture and language could be better incorporated into the ways programs and services are designed and delivered. And finally, Ashley Cummings is a proud Inuit currently living in Whitehorse, Yukon. And as an alum of the Prime Minister Youth Council, Ashley advised the Prime Minister on issues including rural and northern health well-being, supporting ethical and Indigenous-led tourism, mental health, and other issues affecting youth across Canada. Her colorful background living in Nunavut, Yukon, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and New Brunswick has given her a comprehensive perspective on life for young Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast. Ashley currently works at UConstruct, which is a nonprofit providing a community environment to makers and entrepreneurs alike. She's also recently been accepted to the Bachelor of Indigenous Governance program at Yukon University, and she looks forward to studying the ways she can help better her communities. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Bridget Larocque to moderate and lead our discussion today. Bridget.
Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks for that introduction, Jill, and the invite to such an interesting panel with such intellectual Northerners and Indigenous peoples and people studying with the North and our people. So we have about an hour to discuss, well, 50 minutes to discuss some very interesting questions. And so knowing that we're running out of time for our panelists to share their expertise, I'll start. I think the first one, if we can all jump in, Aluki, Tawny, and Ashley. And you know, we start with Aluki, and the first question would be, how can we make gender-based analysis plus GBA plus more accessible and mainstream, so it's more than just an acronym for us, not only in the North, but with our partners in the South?
Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel. I think that first of all, I will share a personal story. So many years ago, I was in my master's class, and the professor asked me, Aluki, well, like you, would you still consider yourself an Inuk, even though you're attending an institution of higher learning? So at the time, that really upset me. I'm able to speak about it now, but I got up, I had a baby on my back in my amauti. I got up and I left the classroom. And I went and I sat in amongst the trees because I was down south, and I cried because a couple weeks earlier, I had had a phone call with my late grandmother, and she had asked me what I was up to these days. And I said, I'm going to school. And her comment, and we're speaking Inuktitut, her comment was, oh, are you unable to finish school? And that made me feel like I was incompetent, that I was not a well-grown human being. Because in Inuit culture, you use parenting skills, child rearing skills called inuina to create a good human being. And so I share those examples, and hopefully it's illustrative of how, based on people's point of view of where they sit in the world. So my grandmother had never gone to formal education and didn't understand what I was doing, because in a very short period of time as Inuit, we have moved from the land to communities. And so formal education is a new kind of experience for us. And this white male professor, for some reason, felt it was okay to question whether or not I was Inuk, with no regard to how that would make me feel as an Inuk who had already struggled with Inuit identity. And I share that because I think the narrative is so important. Words are so important. And so I did complete my master's degree, and I focused on reading books written about Inuit. And I paid special attention to how references to Inuit women were described. And so it was often that Inuit women are subservient, that Inuit practice female infanticide, that Inuit have a cultural practice of wife swapping. And so when you read the documentation carefully, you realize that the infanticide was not solely for female children. It was for each gender. When you read more closely about wife swapping, actually women would also swap men. And so it's so interesting to me that part of the exercise that all of us need to take is to think about, well, what's the experience that the individual has that brings them to think this is the reality for all of us. And so I think I take a lot of that kind of experience of being critical, not in a negative sense, but being critical, inquisitive when I read through things. And so currently in my role, I still do that when I read documents written by the federal government or written by anyone, and I say, well, what does that mean about Inuit? And what is the point of view in which the author is writing about the Arctic? You'll read stuff about how we live in a barren land, how our environment is a harsh environment, that we're struggling to survive. And all those narratives, all those choices of words serve a purpose, because then the society, the system, feels that they're doing a good job of saving us from the harsh environment. They're doing a good job of helping us because our land is so barren. So I think I get to the point that it makes it, all these things jump out as you're reading. And so I think I would just say that any type of critical thinking can be used currently and can be used for past materials, but it's really important that we continue to use that kind of analytical skills when we address current issues that we face as Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. So I'll end it there because I know we're being a conversation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the thinking on misogynistic language as well, Aluki, because that's a lot of the concern we have with gender-based plus analysis is like whose narrative, whose words, whose language. So Ashley, would you like to contribute to the question?
Absolutely, thank you. And Aluki. Thinking about like how to make this more inclusive, at least from a specifically youth perspective, is witnessing a lot more organizations walk the talk of like gender equality and gender support, because like even thinking about my work at UConstruct, challenging gender norms is such a huge part of just what we do, because having a full wood shop and metal shop and a bunch of like equipment of that type, it's very aware that it's a male-dominated field. And so we have things like, we call it Do It Women, that we partner with Yukon Women in Trades and Technology, where we provide safe spaces for women to learn these skills, but also for female tradespeople to share the skills that they've earned. And honestly, like in my time in the working field so far, it's very hard to see organizations actively take a stance to improve gender equality and to actually question why the norm is considered the norm. And I think there's so much more opportunity where youth can be involved in these decision-making things, whether it's in a nonprofit, in government, in anything capitalistic, of course. I also worked for the Yukon NDP during the territorial elections as a speechwriter. And during my time there, like that was another active stance where it was like the candidates were mostly female. That was our dominant gender. And so it was a very important thing for us to challenge the, the men in suits and the, I guess the, cisgendered white male that is often dominating in politics. And yeah, I think there's a lot more opportunity to walk the talk, not just use it as this symbolic thing that we need to do. It's just, you got to take the knowledge that we have, further it by continuing to do the work and figuring out what works best and what works most efficiently in order to have this be less of a question and more of like an active part of our day-to-day lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to kind of put you on the spot, Tawny, hearing what Aluki had to share with her experience at the at university, I'm just wondering, did you ever have similar experiences, or were addressed by through the misogynistic lens and language when you were advancing from your bachelor's to master's to the PhD?
Hello, everybody. Sorry, before I answer, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and we're all treaty people here in Nova Scotia. And I recognize that I'm a settler here, and I'm also the only one that's not in the north right now, which is amazing. I was so excited to be on this panel, and just to, I wish I don't even need to talk. I just want to learn. So I'm happy to do my share of listening here. In terms of academia and kind of I guess the structural barriers, I would say that, well, I think there is an intersectionality to the experience that Aluki has had that I didn't have. There has been barriers in terms of gender, and I mean that has come up in, you show up to a meeting as a young woman and everybody assumes you're a note taker, or you're there to bring water, or that you're not capable of doing certain things, or yeah, so that's been there. But there's also been a lot of support, and I feel very very lucky in that I've had an opportunity to find other women who kind of locked arms and tried to push back on that. And the network that I've helped build includes women from across the North doing different types of work, from policy to the arts to research, and it's been a strong support mechanism, I would say, to know that it's an experience, unfortunately, that I think many face, but to also recognize that there's ways to support one another and to push back a little bit on that with time. I'm assuming that it will take time and for people to learn, and gender-based analysis plus doesn't necessarily mean that people are learning. It might just mean that people are checking boxes, especially when it comes to research. I would say I think it needs to go hand in hand with the work that everybody else is doing. And yeah, I can speak more about that later, but I hope that.
Okay, thank you. So a few of you have already touched on the next question, but if there's anything specific you want to reference, then please go ahead. So what does GBA plus mean to you? How do you incorporate GBA plus into your own work and into your projects? So we'll start with Aluki again, followed by Ashley, and then Tawny.
So in terms of the work that we do at Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, we always take the Inuit-centered approach. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And I guess Earlier, I talked a little bit about the roles of women and men, and how, for me, writing a thesis called Iglumit Istumatay, basically bosses of the household, and I was trying to talk about the role of women, was kind of my pushback in a way to what I had read about Inuit. And I think that often there's an eraser like of Inuit role. And I know this is a panel focused on security and the Arctic. So I was thinking about how has the history evolved, whereas Inuit, we have played a big role for Canada in terms of sovereignty. And I know that's recognized in the preamble of our Nunavut Agreement. And yet, when there are narrations of exploration of the air bases, there's very little information about Inuit. And yet, our history shows that Inuit generally, and then Inuit women specifically, have contributed tremendously in terms of making sure that white explorers would have warm clothing to be able to live in our environment. And I mean, it's documented that even in the 1920s, there's a woman named Ada Blackjack who was the sole survivor of a group of explorers, of male white explorers, and she was the sole survivor as the Inuk woman, right? And I think more stories of that nature has to be shared to remind us of the contributions that Inuit have made to Canadian history. And I would like to point out also in Inuit culture, names are not boys' names or girls' names. So for instance, my late aunt was named Kunuk. And so when I had a child who happened to be a male, I named him Kunuk after my aunt. And so I have this relationship with him, and I have a great deal of respect. And because he's named after my aunt, who I love so dearly and was particularly, I guess, a favorite aunt of mine, that I called her Anana, mother, and I knew before she passed, she had said, when I'm reborn as a male, I'm going to do whatever I want. And so my son, I could see those tendencies, those strengths in him, that he was such a risk taker. And because I knew that of my aunt, even though I worried about his physical safety as his mother, it was very difficult for me to keep him, tell him off and say, stop going up that cliff, you might fall, you know? So I share that as a sort of, as a cultural standpoint, I think we look at what are the strengths of the individuals in our community. And it's so fluid. And the way we raise children is to look at the strengths and to nurture that. So because everyone has different talents and skills, and we need absolutely everyone's skill set to be able to, for the common good, for our common good as Inuit. And I really think that as Inuit, I have the strong belief that we were a self-reliant people. And because of all the things that have happened to us in such a short period of time, we're in a transition period where we're a little bit lost, because we're the education system, for instance, expects us all to be very similar, and doesn't try and capture the strengths and nurture that. And so I think for me, when I think about gender-based analysis, it's all part and parcel of that, and it becomes part of the worldview of how do you include everyone and work on the strengths. And yesterday, during the webinar, they talked a little bit about operational effectiveness And I was like, oh, interesting. Because I think, I mean, I've never used that in my life, but I was thinking, I think that's how we behave as Inuit. Operational effectiveness. What is the strength of this child? How do we nurture their strength so that they can contribute to our common good? And I mean, it sounds very broad, but that's how I approach gender-based analysis, because I think it's a much broader kind of discussion than it's not solely focused on gender. I think it's much broader than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's not just a box we could check off. It has powerful and very deep possibilities for all of us to consider. So I'll move on to Ashley, and yeah, just take it from your own perspective, and please share.
I think for me with GBA Plus, like, it's a very active part of my work in a more like micro level, just because my work is very grassroots and it's very community oriented. And so we're always actively searching for ways to innovate, how to question the norms. So there's a constant like critical questioning of how we can be better and how we can see results to be better. And so it's been a really present part of like my work at UConstruct, but also at the Arctic Institute of Community-Based Research, where I worked with NEAR, and I worked with just a few other research stations, just trying to focus on like agriculture, also youth's place in climate activism. We had really impressive youth from all across Yukon, Northern BC, and NWT. Come for conferences to find ways to do community-based research, to represent their community, like nothing about us without us, which is such an important part of Northern work especially. And so that's been a really important part for work, but then in my own personal life, with my activism and with my my role as like trying to, I guess, better my community in the ways that I can. It's also been an active exploration in my own identity. And more recently, as I like think about, you know, sexuality and gender and how intertwined they really are or are not, it made me realize that being a young Inuk woman and having felt so insecure in my identity because I grew up being told, oh, you talk white, you're not that Inuk. And, you know, all of these like lateral violence things, which is a completely different conversation. But it made me feel very insecure in my culture for a long time. But as I grew older, I found a lot more comfort in it, and I found a lot more validation that regardless of like how Inuk I am, I'm still Inuk. And that questioning in my teenage years left very little room to find within myself like identifying my sexuality, identifying my gender identity. And only now in my early 20s, I'm starting to figure it out and starting to think critically, like, how do I represent myself? How do I feel about other people representing themselves differently? And I think that really shows how ingrained a lot of colonialism and forced religion that has been placed upon Indigenous peoples, not having the space to think about their identity critically beyond just trying to defend their blood quantum, which is such an unfair act that was placed upon Indigenous peoples all across Canada by the government of Canada. And so I don't think that there has been enough discussion and space to challenge those colonial norms in order to really return to our traditional values on gender and sexuality, where a lot of it was so much more fluid than a lot of the older anthropology papers tend to display. And so I think that's a lot of different thoughts about like my personal and my work-based feelings on gender-based analysis. But yeah, I think that's the main gist of it.
Thank you so much. And I think this is, you know, where Aluki is moving us towards as well. And the work I do is that GBA Plus is a acronym, and it's the buzzword of the day. but you know, we can't really look at GBA plus if we don't look at the colonized systems that are you know, advancing it to this day. But we have to look at it from a decolonized perspective, and how do we want to, as Indigenous peoples, incorporate GBA plus in our everyday lives and in the institutions that we've already created and are developing. So, you know, decolonization is huge. And also, you know, when we talk about community healing and our responsibility, we have to talk about lateral violence, because that's such a colonized worldview that has just really not destroyed, but has really impaired our Indigenous worldview. So we really have to be conscious of that. So Tawny, do you want to share your experiences?
Sure. Again, I'll speak a bit more from a research perspective. A lot of the work that I've done on GBA plus type of work is not actually based in Canada. So it's mostly been based in the Nordics. So I started that a while ago, and then I, you know, came to Canada to do my PhD and realized, oh, what's this thing, GBA plus? Oh, it's this thing that I've, you know, a lot of my colleagues and I have already been doing, but it's this acronym that apparently represents this, and it's a requirement. And really started to look at the projects that are out there and notice, well, it seems like a lot of projects that were already focusing on gender neatly, you know, can follow GBA plus, but then there's all these other projects where I'm not necessarily seeing gender or intersectionality or any type of proper analysis being done. And it's mostly a focus on Arctic security, infrastructure development, military, and geopolitics. And well, that's all fine and well, and you know, these conversations need to be had as well. But based on the panel yesterday, I mean, people mentioned as well that you're hard pressed to find people talking about gender in those contexts, and that it's always generally a group of women that are, I mean, all of the panelists on these 3-day panels are women talking about gender, and it's always a surprise that when it comes to gender, the torch is carried by women and not necessarily persons of different genders. So I guess my question is, if the places that I've worked in Finland, or even with colleagues in Iceland, if they're able to do gender-based analysis without this acronym, what is the acronym actually adding? Is it really an administrative thing, that hurdle that people need to jump through in order to get their funding? And yeah, how does that play out? I'd be very curious to see a lot of, you know, final reports on how gender-based analysis was integrated into discussions on security and all of these different things, and like actually exploring how infrastructure impacts people and in community, and whether that was at all a factor in decision making.
Exactly. That's another question that we'd have to look at is, you know, how are we using it, and how is it really researched or analyzed? Because, you know, a lot of voices, women's voices, gendered voices, aren't heard, and nor they incorporated into the governance models of the Indigenous institutions in the Arctic. So if we move on to, and we've alluded to some of this already, so but once again, if there's a specific challenge you want to share, then please do. What are the challenges of applying GBA plus? Are there more tools or supports that the government should provide policymakers and academics to more readily access GBA plus? And not always wanted to put Aluki on the spot to start, but I think she just guides the questions perfectly. So Aluki, if you don't mind.
Thank you. In terms of public policy approaches, I mean, we're such a huge nation of Canada, and we all have different realities based on our environment. So I think it's important that even if there's a national public policy, that there be thought about how that is received by the population. And it might be a youth population, it might be a race population, it might be based on gender, but it's crucially important that those kind of considerations be taken into account. For instance, one of the things that we work on consistently is food insecurity. In Nunavut, 7 out of 10 Inuit children are going to bed each night hungry. And there's the Nutrition North Canada program, a federal program that supports and subsidizes processed foods that you can purchase in stores, and that's great. But it doesn't meet all the needs and doesn't address how we're still very much a hunting society, a harvesting society. And many of us still love our Inuit country food, whether it's caribou or beluga or polar bears, and none of that is ever captured as something that needs to be supported. And so part of the work we've done is to try and raise awareness about our realities, that we don't necessarily want people coming into our territory and establishing greenhouses because that's the best nutrition we should be having, right? I mean, part of it is building on the strengths of the people in their environment. And so I think part of the approach, and I appreciated how Tanya was saying that it's not called gender-based analysis, but it's still done in the Nordic countries. So to me, that kind of approach needs to occur where we're not necessarily saying tick, 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 I want to tick off this box, but we're thinking, well, how do we meet the people we're trying to develop a public policy about for their benefit? And so I know we've advocated for a harvester support grant to have the federal government recognize that we don't have a strong agricultural industry in Nunavut, in the same sense that maybe a Western Prairies jurisdiction might have. But we do have our own kind of economies that would allow us to be self-reliant, that's based on our environment, that builds on our strengths. And those are the types of things that need to be supported and would probably have a long-lasting, positive, transformational impact in our communities, rather than some of the things that are brought up as public policy approaches that last for a year or so and then are not positive and don't last. So I think I would kind of tend to go towards that kind of approach and meet people where they're at, because we're all trying our best, in my view. All of us are trying our best to have our best life. And so public policy needs to meet us where we are and help us with those challenges that we might have.
Thank you. Ashley?
Thank you. I think, well, I couldn't really speak to the government and policymakers in particular, just because that's not a sphere I'm very versed in. But I think there's a lack of general knowledge on the subject, or at least like wide general knowledge, of course. And I think that like outside of government and academic discussions, like this isn't really a big active part of just conversations in a more grassroots community level. And so naturally there would be pushback if you're not familiar with this type of thing. And it's just a big active effort that can be really intimidating, especially when it is held at this pedestal of like, this is government and policymakers and academics. And so that intimidates the average person who's just trying to find ways to be better. I completely agree with Aluki that I think everyone is trying to be better. And it needs to be placed in a more conversational base, I think, in order to make it more accessible, in order to make it more of like, okay, like this is something that's attainable, this is something that we can work towards and actively make a part of our day-to-day work and personal lives. That way we can ensure people aren't left behind. That way we can ensure people are feeling supported in their work or in their whatever community they may be in. And so I think in order to make it that more accessible and facing the challenges actively, it's just needing to find those ways to educate in a I lost my train of thought as I was saying it, but educating people in a way that is less exclusive to the larger language of academics and government, and instead making it much more of a conversation and having it be kind of not exclusive, especially thinking about my work on Kids Help Phone, where they actively make blog posts, educational materials at a 6th grade reading level, just to make sure the language is accessible to as many people as they can. And I think that's a really beautiful way of being like, hey, this is something we can do. We have the resources to do this. And in order to make mental health more of an active conversation to everyone, why wouldn't we do it? And so that can be applied more broadly to GBA+. We can make that more accessible for people who aren't in government or policy.
Thank you. Tawny, do you have any specific experiences you'd like to share?
Sure, my mind is swirling right now. I'm not sure what to say first, but I guess, Bridget, you and I were a part of this report that came out last week, and one of the big findings was that there's just insufficient data on, I guess in the case of the research that I did on the interaction between gender and environment and how persons of different genders interact with, the impacts of climate change or food insecurity, with, pollutants, things like that. And I mean, that's one element where, that can't rest on the shoulders of one individual researcher to try and gather all of that. That also needs to be a priority of the government to try and actually understand the experiences of different people. And that means, not just the gender binary, which is what we generally collect data on. It needs to be absolutely everybody, as defined also by the individual communities and how they understand it. That, of course, comes with another challenge, which is, collecting data on communities is also very sensitive. And, there's been tremendous historical trauma from that type of action. And so there needs to be sensitivity to how that is done. And it really just goes to show that, in capitals, decisions require that type of data because really the people don't always know community, and the people who know community best are the people in the community. And so, like you mentioned, it's really about kind of bridging, these international commitments that countries like Canada make to, Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality, how that trickles down into your community, and what that actually means. And once you start looking into it, I mean, there's so many gaps in terms of how that's supposed to be met within certain timeframes. So yeah, it needs to come from all sides. And I guess my argument is that one tool is not going to solve all of that, but one can be hopeful, I guess.
We could be hopeful. I think, it is imperative that, we need data and we need statistics. And if it's the Indigenous organizations doing it and being clear on how they're going to share it with government, what needs to be shared, how it should be shared, and for what purpose. And if it is policy development, then we need our Indigenous voices to be there at the table, developing the policy, co-development, in a true meaning of the word, not just signing off on it because they were at the table. So those are, real issues and things that we still have to work on under gender equality in the Arctic. And, we've had conversations about that with phase 4. So may that good work not get left behind or overlooked. We've touched a bit on this second to last question we have here, but public policy approaches can sometimes make people feel alienated and marginalized. How can we better incorporate inclusivity in GBA plus and beyond? Feel free to discuss your own philosophies, and I think a few of us have done that already, on inclusivity and teaching. Luki, I know you've alluded to that too, with respect to community, nurturing your strengths and your gifts, and and the responsibility of us as parents and elders and community leaders, and then connecting that to our current environment. And we've talked a bit about two, co-management and then land-based and community-based. Is there anything specific that we can take from as a best practice or a learning experience with respect to Indigenous worldviews that connect to our indigeneity and to our own way of knowing, doing, and being that can benefit us as we move forward? So Ashley, I know you've worked with a few organizations, grassroots. So do you want to start on this one? And then we'll give the floor to Luki. I know she has to leave us at 11, so then we can try to get her voice in as much as possible.
For sure. With a lot of my work having it being very grassroots, very community oriented, it's a constant lens of criticalness and openness. So that sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but it's always trying to find the ways that gaps aren't being filled, and always trying to find like who is being left out, who do we not see around this table, who do we not see in this workshop, who do we not see in whatever. And so it needs to be less of a like the ticking boxes that we mentioned, and more of a conversation that's constantly being worked at, constantly being questioned. And that is like, while that can be very tiring at times, especially after a long day of a board of directors meeting, for example, but like regardless of that, it's still something that we need to do as we continue to grow as a society who is more globalized and finding more ways that we are unintentionally leaving people out. And having that lens of being critical of who's there, why are they there, do they need to be there, who else can fill that spot too. And so having that be a very active part of discussion and finding ways that to bring the people who are being left out into the conversation. And also it's just, I feel really proud to see a lot of young parents and families these days having such an active lens towards inclusivity and towards teaching kindness, and not always criticalness, especially to children, because they're such like important conduits to happiness. And so it's a really interesting thing to witness the ways like parenting has shifted in order to be more inclusive and in order to make nicer kids in their schools, to eliminate even the chance of gender-based exclusion, at least to the extent that they can as children, because of course kids, they find ways to be weird and wild, but there's so many casual conversational ways to find the gaps that we're missing, find the important discussions that we're not having, especially now that we have much more space to have these discussions with such a wide range of experts through Zoom, having it be such an important part of our day-to-day lives now. Yeah.
Thank you. Aluki, on to you.
Thank you. I think I want to talk a little bit about relationships. For Inuit, relationships are so important. We have very complex kinship systems, and it helps us position ourselves and understand how we fit into the world. And I think when we look at the history and we look at how Ada Blackjack might not get as much recognition as the white explorers that she outlived, or how it was only last week that Kapik Atagutiak, who's now 100 years old, got recognized for her contributions during the Second World War in terms of picking up bones and different material to be sent down south to be used for munition. And I think what part of it is the narrative I started off with about how do we rebuild this relationship so that Inuit are viewed as equal, that Inuit experience, Inuit stories are as important as Canadian stories, that Canadian white stories. How can there be more attention, for instance, about, and I think there's currently continues to be a race relationship in our communities. In Nunavut, 85% of us are Inuit, and yet we see how non-Inuit are flourishing in our territory while we live in poverty. I mean, I'll use an example. The median total income for Inuit in Nunavut is $22,523. In comparison to for non-Inuit who live in Nunavut, the median total income is $101,494. And that's what we see every single day. And so how do we work to adjust that relationship? I'm working right now in Iqaluit, which was established with an American air base. My house is in Nakungu, Apex, which is on the outskirts of Iqaluit. The history of that is that Nakungu is where Inuit lived, and white people lived here in the American air base, and Inuit were not allowed to be here, right? That's our history. And that those remnants still remain, even though Inuit continue to provide such an important role in Canadian sovereignty by living in the farthest Inuit community in Canada, in Grise Fiord, by continuing to have Inuit rangers who are the eyes and ears of our country in the Arctic. And yet there's no recognition of that. There's no value, that it's not as important. And I mean, we see that in everything, even in our language and how materials are provided to our communities. Yes, last week, a couple weeks ago, I received the 2021 census paper in my door, in my porch. I looked at it. In Nunavut, 85% of us are Inuit. Our mother tongue, the majority of the mother tongue spoken in Nunavut is Inuktitut. The material was in English and French, and I recognize that those are the national official languages of this nation. But how is it going to disadvantage unilingual Inuktitut-speaking people from participating in the census, which is so crucially important to address the needs that we have in terms of overcrowded housing, you know? And so I think the relationship of Inuit and other people is so important to reestablish. And I have hope. I don't want to leave it hopeless with a hopeless feeling. I have hope that organizations such as the current one I'm working with is able to work on Inuit Nunangat policy with the federal government that kind of has an Inuit specific approach to policy development and legislation. And so I hope that over time, we will continue to start influencing how policies actually meet our needs and treat us and respect us enough to treat us as though we're equal people of Canada. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate having been able to speak about all these issues with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, Aluki, just before you go, I know you only have a few minutes. The final question we had was about Arctic security. And when discussing hard security, so the militarization in the Arctic, there are important gaps that need to be addressed. Are you able to share any importance of including soft security to add to the broader discussion of hard militarized security in the Arctic?
Well, I think one of the components is using Inuit knowledge of the land, of the sea, of the ice. And I think it makes most sense that the rangers that currently exist in our communities who are Inuit are relied upon that, because we often rely on rangers also to help us with search and rescue missions. And so many people in our communities have many hats on. So these rangers are often also hunters and are regularly on the land. So it makes sense to me that part of the approach needs to be what can we find out from the people who live there before coming in with ideas about how to fix things or how to approach things. I mean, without dwelling on it, if that had occurred when they were looking for the Erebus ship, for instance, it would have been a much shorter period in which the remnants would have been found. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is such a blessing to hear all your wisdom and knowledge, and keep up the good work. And thank you for your participation in the panel. So Ashley, would you like to take a stab at the question and share your thoughts?
For sure. I will fully admit that I don't know a whole lot about security, but I know it's important. And so I think, I really agree with Aluki that it is something that we need to, if we need these like hard and soft securities in the Arctic, like we need to speak with the traditional peoples upon this land. Even thinking about here in Yukon with such vast amount of wilderness that just like Nunavut is so big and wide, but here there's trees that hide everything. So it's like, it's a complicated thing to look for so many different things. Like we've had plane crashes that haven't been found for 50 plus years. We've got people who are still missing after decades and decades of searching. And it's all like very heart-wrenching and big questions that you don't know how to answer because you don't know how to find what you're missing. And especially like thinking about, the Arctic being, the place of human flagpoles, just establishing our spot on this land that we call Canada. And it's, it's just a very complicated thing. And to extend to the point of what Aluki was saying about the census, and how exclusive it is to just the 2 official languages of Canada, excluding a lot of communities, especially like, for example, here in Yukon Old Crow, there are quite a few speakers, I think. I could be wrong, but just like trying to understand that, people are different. People know their home and their land best, and having their voices in security, especially when we have land guardians, and having that as more of an active movement amongst Indigenous communities, protecting our traditional territories and our natural resources in this way. And I think that is a really important way of like actively approaching and also creating more job opportunities for Indigenous folks to bring ourselves out of poverty with something that is like very needed and not just a capitalistic advance. Like tourism is great. Being a person who works on cruise ships, for example, and worked at museums, like, yeah, those are all good and great. But as we saw with the pandemic, they were worth nothing in the end. I lost out on so many contracts that I was really looking forward to. And we shouldn't be putting so much weight upon these capitalistic endeavors, and instead supporting Indigenous peoples by creating job security and creating these important ways of inclusion, and not just perpetuating this like incredibly hard cycle of poverty and shame that is placed upon a lot of Indigenous communities. So, you know, once again, don't know a whole lot about security itself, but yeah, I know about people.
And I think that's the root of it. You know, we wouldn't discuss security if there weren't any people. So, you know, I think you know more than the Western and non-Indigenous wisdom is trying to force upon us. So we're moving into question and answer shortly, but Tawny, I'd really love to hear, you know, your thoughts on hard power versus soft power and what it is that we may need in the Arctic.
I wish this was always had a gender component to it. This question, in my mind, I know it's an academic discussion to have hard and soft, but in my mind, you know, people's ability to eat and you know, take care of their families is, you know, should be the hard part of security, not in terms of difficulty, but in terms of you know, something that we should take very seriously and should be the most important discussion. I believe in our discussion in preparation for this meeting, Aluki mentioned, you know, that it's important to protect the people and for people to be able to continue to live, because really that's why the Arctic is what the Arctic is in part. And I think in a lot of discussions on security, there's a lot of conversation about the environment and a changing environment, and it takes a while until you get to a point where the people aren't you know, a part of the military or a part of search and rescue, but they're actually people in community, living in the North and wanting to stay in the North. And so that should really be a priority. And my hope is that, you know, gender is a part of that discussion moving forward, because you know, you need to have a community or a society that you know, feels healthy and strong, according to its own measure, rather than, you know, is essentially a government's pawn to some degree in advancing its own national strategic interests. So these are the things I wish I could say on some of the other calls, but yeah.
Well, you know, as long as you get the messaging out there, I think the reality is that, you know, the land, the Arctic, is our home, and it is where we choose to live, and we want to live, you know. So when we're talking about Arctic security, we need to have the conversation with the inhabitants of the land, and not only look at it as as you indicated, a militaristic process, but what is it that we're trying to secure, and who needs to be involved and engaged in that conversation. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I'll give it back to Jill or Kirsty, I think, and or Shannon to do the Q&A. And once again, thank you for your wisdom, your knowledge, your participation.
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today, panelists and participants alike. So as Bridget mentioned, we'll be kicking off the question and answer period. So if you do have any questions for our panelists, it could be for all of them or someone in particular, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box, and then I will read through any questions that we have. To begin, we do have one question that is for everyone. What do you think are some strategies to bring those marginalized into the conversation, considering that they may not hear about the programs or initiatives because they're not the policy government research circles that attempt to service them? Bridget, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I don't know if we need specific strategies. I think we already know how to dialogue with people. I think the biggest hurdle to get over, though, is that the assumption that the national organizations are the voice of the grassroots people. And sometimes the national organizations, unfortunately, are heavily funded and really strong partners with the federal government or the politicians of the day. So I think it's imperative that, you know, the policy makers at the federal government have conversations with the communities that they feel will be impacted. And that goes right to phoning up the people in the community, or, you know, if you're in the territory, you know, have a town hall meeting, or, you know, don't hesitate to go knock on doors and talk to people, because this is where if policies to be effective, it has to be knowledge from the people most impacted. You know, I can't tell you what's best for Inuvik right now. I live in Yellowknife. So, you know, no use talking to me if you're really wanting to hear what's happening to the remote regionalized communities. So I think that's what you have to do, is you really have to move away from reaching out to the people that do not necessarily know the reality and truth of the respective region or territory.
Did anyone else want to jump in and give any insights into that? Ashley, I see you nodding.
Yeah. I think, like, I feel like a very sorry not sorry attitude with this, where if you're trying to service a community, you need to meet them where they're at. And so it's really unfortunate that, you know, within policy, government, and research circles attempting to service communities that they're not a part of, like, they look for people like activists like me to speak on behalf of these communities. And, like, you know, that's well and good when we're speaking broadly, but speaking to the, like Bridget said, speaking to the specific needs, I couldn't do that. That's not right, and that's not my place. And so, like, even thinking about my own hometown, the best way to reach everyone in the community is our community Facebook page, because, you know, it's a community of 1,500 people, and there are 1,100 people on that Facebook group. So everyone's going to see it. And if they don't see it, then someone will tell them. It's not a very big town. And so it's an important way to, like, utilize these really wild tools that have come out of capitalism, out of globalization, all of these different weird and interesting parts of the internet, and how accessible it is becoming, even though in the North it is an incredibly slow movement towards having, you know, pretty reasonable standards for internet access. But I think we need to just, you know, suck it up, do the legwork, at least for a bit, because once those connections are established, then it's great. Like, I'm very fortunate to be a part of so many different communities and so many different just family, friends, and work, that if people ask me, like, hey, I want to hear about this, do you know anyone? Then I can be like, hey, I know these 3 people in this community, and this community. And utilizing those connections is really important to start, because, you know, what else are we going to do till we establish those connections securely and in a trustworthy manner? So.
Great, thank you. Tawny, I have a question for you. So throughout this discussion, we've heard a lot about checking boxes, or, you know, a lack of understanding of how to actually include GBA+ in your work. But I know that a lot of your work specifically is in Nordic countries, and you mentioned that people are kind of already doing this. They're already incorporating gender in their research. Do you have any exposure to the government departments doing that when you were working abroad? And do you find that they're more willing to engage with GBA, however they wanted to say it, and intersectionality in their work?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking from my own experience, so I mean, I'm not certain how other people have experienced this in their work in the Nordics. I gave a presentation earlier today to the Finnish Foreign Ministry on this chapter that we did, and there was a very strong feeling of gender equality just being part and parcel of kind of the everyday workings of the ministries and the projects that they hope to do and are doing. And there was very little explanation that needed to happen, and there was a recognition that, you know, the definition of gender is changing, and that, you know, there's so much to be learned still, that we, you know, don't have a full picture, but also a willingness to continue. And it does feel encouraging to actually not have to include gender in, you know, projects on environment just because it's a requirement, but that it's actually encouraged, and that it is something that, you know, people are interested in and looking for. I haven't necessarily experienced that as much in Canada. I think, you know, there's, you know, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, there we go, and other foundations that are willing to fund this type of research, but I think it's still, you know, departments aren't necessarily always talking to one another. So sometimes these things are quite fringe still in terms of the knowledge that we have here in Canada, I would say. But you know, obviously, my thoughts only.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from someone who is working as a military recruiter who traveled to the Arctic and was an instructor for Raven. The question is, having seen how strong the Indigenous women of the North are, how can we do a better job of attracting women from the North to the military, even for a short time? Bridget, I see you smiling. Do you want to take this one?
I'm smiling and giggling at the same time, but I really don't have the answer. I was in cadets a very short time. I couldn't tolerate people yelling and screaming at me. I guess it depends on where you want us to be in the Canadian forces, what role we'd be playing, because there again, it's a very male-dominated environment, and it comes with certain regiments, and it comes with certain disciplines that are not Indigenous ways of doing and knowing. We are observers, we're patient, we sit and watch. In militarization, in the military forces, as far as I know, it is very male dominated. It's very misogynistic. It's very what's the word, disciplined, where it's ordered. So there again, it's a totally different perspective in a learning environment. It works for some, but not for all. So I think it all depends on, like I said, what role, and are they willing to change the way they want to or can attract us into that work. You know, can we join this environment, this militarization family, from a more softened approach, get trained up from a more humanized teaching process, as opposed to the rigidness of the forces. So like I said, I don't have any really hardcore offerings right now, but I think there'd have to be some type of a softening approach. Also, you know, guarantees that women entering into this environment, there will be protections and security for us, because we've all heard the stories of sexual abuse and assaults and so forth. So, you know, that's the last thing you'd want to do is suggest to your daughters or your friends, oh, join the military, right? Because, you know, you're not wanting to, you know, put them into an environment that's not safe for them.
Ashley or Tawny, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Speaking more, I guess, like, I'll start with, I guess, a broad perspective. Like, being a young Indigenous woman, the potential of becoming a missing and murdered Indigenous woman or girl is a very active part of my day-to-day life. It's a very active consideration. Like, if I'm walking downtown here in Whitehorse at night, then I call a friend while I'm walking. Like, there are so many little active things that I do, especially, like, for example, I get off work at 9 p.m. sometimes, and, you know, walking to my car, I have my keys in my fist. And, like, there is such a lack of security for Indigenous women in our own country. And so it becomes hard to, like, trust that if we were to enter the military, that we would receive the same, you know, personal active efforts of avoiding becoming a victim of some kind. And so I think we need, in order to make this seem like a more a larger opportunity for jobs for Indigenous women, then we need to address missing and murdered Indigenous women first. If we can't find that security in our own country, how are we going to find it elsewhere? But to shift away from that in another conversation, being the type of person who really loves to take adventurous opportunities and find ways to challenge myself and to better myself or see a different point of view, like, I realize I don't even know all the different job opportunities within the military. And so maybe in a more reasonably quick way of looking at it, it would be finding ways to display these different job opportunities and how accessible they can be for Indigenous women, and how we can utilize our skills. As Aliki was saying earlier in the panel, Inuit are a very skill-based and, you know, prideful people on what we do. And so having these perspectives and, like, finding out the different job opportunities, I think that would be a good way to start as we as a country continue to address the incredible injustice that is the fact that we have a whole acronym for a group of women being killed. And so it's a very big, wide issue that we need to address from that perspective. And also having friends in the Coast Guard. Most of the women I know in the Coast Guard are Indigenous women too. So maybe this is an opportunity to chat with the folks with the Coast Guard to see, like, how do they create these programs, like, and how do they attract, especially a lot of young Indigenous women, to enter these programs. So maybe there's an opportunity for more of an active partnership on recruiting people to join these, like, protective forces.
Tawny, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Bridget and Ashley responded perfectly. Yeah, I did want to mention the Coast Guard, but that was just raised. So that's a really nice example, I think, that, you know, we should definitely look into. And just to kind of also agree that, you know, Indigenous women are absolutely incredible, especially Arctic Indigenous women, I think are, you know, we have so much to learn. So, you know, there need to be more panels like this attended by more people on, you know, recognizing that everybody has a million things to do and doesn't really have time for these things. So
Just to add, you know, we have a lot of female rangers as well, and gendered rangers, and they're doing a great job. You know, and it's important that, you know, we build on that, their strengths there as well, and bring their voices to the table where we can.
Perfect. We have a couple more minutes, and I was just wondering, Tawny and Bridget, I know you contributed to the 2021 Pan-Arctic report on gender equality in the Arctic. I wondered if you could speak to some of the chapters and contributions that you made to that, and what were some of the, I know you had mentioned some of the conclusions that came out of that. Tawny, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I guess there were some overarching conclusions, and Bridget can, add to this, correct me, that cut across all chapters. And, of course, I know my chapter the best, but so I won't try to butcher anybody else's chapter here. I think the biggest one was gender and sex disaggregated data. Another big one was the need for gender mainstreaming and greater attention being paid to intersectionality across the North. In terms of policy making, there was a recognition that most policy making is gender blind. That includes people in decision making positions being represented, as well as in the actual wording of the policies. Yeah, so those were kind of the three that stood out in our work. Yeah, Bridget, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the biggest, I contributed to the introduction and reviewed several chapters, and I think the biggest concern here is that lack of data and lack of statistics, not because of the Indigenous communities not wanting to share that information, because there just isn't any. And I think, when we talk about intersectionality from an academic or Western worldview, from an Indigenous worldview, all it means is all my relations, all lives matter. We're all interconnected. We're all interconnected. The animate, inanimate, our innate knowledge, our innate wisdom, and our Indigenous worldview. So our ways of knowing, doing, and being, our ways of taking up responsibility, our ways of nurturing gifts, that voice and that story, that narrative, if we want to use that word. So our stories have to be told, and they have to be heard, and they have to be recognized. The biggest threat we have from this report, the Gender Equality report, GS3, is that, it'll be another huge report that gets shelved and collects dust. So, as we move into phase 4, then how do we make sure that the Indigenous voices get heard, the people in the Arctic that make the Arctic their home, the circumpolar world, that we do have a voice, we do have experience that can build on really bringing our people out of disparity and away from marginalization. So I think these are the things that we bring to the table as circumpolar residents, people from the land. And I think more and more recognition is coming to that at the international table, at the Arctic Council table, and then it informs then, or connects back to, and even supplements or supports the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, that's the optimistic, positive thinking that we have. And of course, we need to have that hope. So, that, in the next couple of years, we see changes for our people in the North and the Arctic, that because, at the end of the day, it's 2021. There's so many issues we have to be concerned with. And yet we're dealing with archaic, ancient stories. We shouldn't be telling these stories in 2021. No.
Great, thank you. So I'm just being conscious of time here. I was just wondering, to our panelists, do you have any final closing thoughts, conclusions from this panel, anything that you wanted to add, and plug any upcoming works that are coming out? Bridget, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Yeah, we have, hoping that we're moving into phase 4 of the Arctic gender equality work, and that, we need more Indigenous perspectives, and we need to, you know, have that support from not only our communities but from our governments and the state we reside in. But you know, there's more need right now for us to bring GBA plus and intersectionality and other concerns that impact gender to the table. So thanks for having this panel. And I look forward to more panels that really address the unpacking of gender-based analysis that includes the decolonization, that includes indigeneity, and really works on decolonization of the systems that we're still finding ourselves in. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. Ashley?
Yeah, I guess to plug something, I am a freelance speaker, so please contact me and I'm happy to talk. But also, I wanted to, keeping an eye on the Q&A and seeing P. Whitney Lackenbauer's comment, like I wanted to kind of bring up that, not to speak on behalf of Bridget, but the very fact that, like, I'm glad to hear that the military has been really supportive of the Indigenous people that you mentioned, but also the fact that Bridget has this perspective really shows that there's a broken connector between how the military is and how it's perceived. And so that's a really important thing that we need to, like, try and find where that communication barrier is happening, where it is seen as this kind of big conglomerate misogynistic thing. And I know people in the military who are amongst the kindest people I've ever met. But still, that doesn't change the fact that this huge conglomerate, intimidating organization is intimidating. And so I hope that there's a way that that can be a critical lens to view how to change it. But I'm just really thankful to have been able to learn from all of you in this panel. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope that we can cross paths again soon.
Thanks, Ashley. Tony?
It's amazing. I just realized the Q&A function here. So I've entered the 21st century just now. I wanted to thank you all for this wonderful and insightful conversation. I think just to reflect on the reporting, and I think the biggest takeaway was, you know, it's a very large report on all the things that are important, but we don't know enough about. And so I'd really like to encourage all the people on this call who do research to really start to think about the role that, you know, gender and inclusivity play in their work, and to think about the teams that they build, and to think about how they lead projects and the ways in which they can work with different communities to actually understand what gender means for those communities, and to then, you know, share that knowledge if appropriate, and kind of guide the way in terms of how this can be done. I think, you know, sometimes governments need to also be shown what the best approach is, and we can't always wait for someone in government to try and figure it out for us. So
amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. I just wanted to wrap up here, and of course, thank you, Bridget, so much for moderating. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here, Tawny, Ashley, and Aluki, who's now left. But it was a great, engaging discussion. I'm so happy to have had you all here for it. Your time and knowledge is so greatly appreciated. We really, I really appreciate it. I had a great time. I hope everyone did. And so with that said, thank you to participants. Thank you for the questions. And I'd also like to thank our partners in this webinar series, DSFG, Women in International Security Canada, and the Center for Social Innovation and Community Engagement in Military Affairs. And of course, if you missed the last couple, but we're having a couple more in the webinar series, 2 more tomorrow and Friday. And I think Kirsty will plug into the chat the links for those who are interested in continuing the panel and discussion on GBA Plus in the next couple of days. You can register and get all the information at the Defense and Security Foresight Group's website from the University of Waterloo. Thank you so much to everybody for taking part.